Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. It's not often I get to speak to people who are also standing at the same time, so you can join me in this part here. Emmett, who is here, asked me right before this thing started, Dad, how long will you be? You think maybe 15 minutes? So I think that's his expectation of how long this is going to be here. So part of being the preacher's kid and going to these things is you get to sit, and he chose the front row today to be at all this here. When I was Emmett's age, I lived in a small community in West Tennessee, Latham, Tennessee. You can't find it on most maps, but it's there somewhere, and a couple of stoplights, or not stoplights, stop signs that could have bring it off from the town there. And there were two gentlemen who would come down to the gas station / breakfast spot / place where you bought guns / tire changing area / deer check-in joint. That was the only thing you had in town in West Tennessee that my family owned. And they were named Herb and Johnny. And Herb and Johnny had a very simple life. I was thinking about the simplicity. I thought there was not a simpler life I'd ever noticed than Herb and Johnny. They would come up early in the morning with their boat in the back, a John boat. They would eat breakfast, and then they would head off and they would fish every single day. Now, later on, I realized that Herb and Johnny's life, they were two friends, and I realized that they probably had some issues and other things in their life going on, but it seemed from an 8-year-old, what a life to live. You got up every single morning, you didn't go to a job, you didn't go to any place you had to be at. You simply got up, you got in your boat, and you fished until you got done fishing, and you came home and you did the same thing the next day over and over again, and that's how they lived their life. When I think of simplicity, I think about how easy of a life that must have been. They knew what they liked to do. They liked to fish, and they did that every single day of their life. Now, looking back, I'm not sure it's the best use of your life to go out there every single day and fish. I'm also not sure exactly if they had other issues in their life that might have led them to the fact they couldn't have families and wives. I know both Johnny and Herb were married before, so I'm assuming maybe the wives didn't care for the fact they wanted to go and fish every single day of their lives. But that was my model of what simplicity looks like. When Tim called and said, do you mind doing a lesson on deeper simplicity, I almost had to laugh on the phone thinking about the fact that during that exact same week, my wife was creating our Google Calendar, which is an essential feature in our household. And in Google Calendars, where we keep everything that we have to get done. This might not even work, because let me come over here and hit the button here, throughout our areas. And we have a calendar that has everything written out and what you have to do. We have 3 kids. All 3 of our kids are very much involved in various activities. We limit it to 1 per kid, or we try to with regards to sports and what they do, but all of them play competitively in various things, so the calendar fills up quickly. I work at Woodson Chapel. I also work another job for a healthcare tech company. I've done that for several years, partially because of Emmett's healthcare needs. We moved into that space, and so my calendar is filled up with travel as well. And so we were getting together, and we were putting together a Google Calendar basically to see where do we need to call friends, family, the National Guard to come in and step, who gets to go take some kids somewhere during that particular week. And when Tim called and said, hey, I think people are really struggling with this idea of overpacked schedule and overpacked lives, I think it'd be great to do a good lesson on simplicity. I thought was he overhearing my wife's conversation with us as we're kind of going through and figuring out what is the next best step. We live in my family is what's called the messy middle. There's a financial guy in Franklin, Tennessee, who does a podcast, and he speaks about individuals from the age of about 30 to 50, and you have multiple kids, and there's this kind of messy middle of life to where you never have enough time, it feels like, and money's always going other places, and you're trying to simplify, but life, as much as you try to simplify, gets messier by the moment. And so he talks about, one, giving yourself grace and living that life. Yep, you're going to have times in where it's going to be hectic. He also talks about, as he is a little bit older now, that in 10 years when it's done with, you're going to stop and realize, man, I loved all the stuff that we were doing, and I wish we could go back to some of those things. But he also talks about, in the midst of that messy middle, don't forget about what's truly important. Now, he's going from a financial standpoint, that you don't mess up things in your future life. But his idea is, in the midst of chaos, don't forget what's there. Simplicity. Some of us, there are days whenever I'm about to hit an airplane, which is my second office, and fly to various spots either to do preaching stuff or do the other job that I do, that I'm thinking it would be nice just to go get in a John boat and go on to Reelfoot Lake, which is a small lake here or big lake in West Tennessee, and just fish all day long without a worry in the world. And then all of a sudden mortgage comes due and you've got to pay for gas and food, and you realize that's a great thing to do for a day or two, but I'd have to go back to work eventually. Most of us live in that similar category. Looking across the room today, I have individuals who seem like you're either starting your careers or starting families in the midst of families. So you probably live in a very similar part of life that I do, where there's always stuff to do and things to have done and things you should do next. And we also live with the constant pressure of busy is the default and how we want to sort of live our life. I grew up, again, in West Tennessee. My peepaw, Tony, had a favorite word, and he would say work any chance he could. He loved working. In fact, in retirement, he lasted about 2 months. We were crop farmers. He crop farmed all this time. He retired, lasted 2 months in retirement, got bored of that, decided to become a cattle farmer right afterwards. And then for fun, when he wanted to relax, he'd go and restore old tractors and go sell them off. That was his idea. And my family background is, if there's a minute in the day, you should be doing something productive. Going through life, you didn't set back. You didn't have a time of relaxation. You went and you worked and did the very next thing. And that's part of what we had here. We live in a life in which we're looking and saying, help at times. There's so much going on and so much pressure to be busy. It's hard. And if you're a parent, you get this as well, right? You go to school and you have your kids interact with other individuals, or you go to different groups, or you go to church and you've got kids in various activities, so you always have the guilt of, are we doing enough? Should they be doing this? Should we be doing that thing? Are we pushing them behind in some way? You know, someone comes along and says, hey, you need to get your kid in after-school robotics and AI technology because that's the future. You're thinking, man, should my 4-year-old who's having a tough time tying his shoes, should he be doing robotics today instead of, running around gymnastics? That's the stuff we get in our mind to think we have to overpack our calendars just to sort of fit in. And we're not immune to it as Christians. We still have the same idea. We're trying to live a Christian life, also being good parents and good fathers and good husbands and good providers and good wives, so whatever it is across the board there. We're trying to do this, and our calendars and our lives get quite busy. There's always something to do. My wife, as I said a moment ago, is in charge of the Google Calendar at our house. She's also in charge of me, which means I will call and say, hey, what's going on tonight? To which he typically responds, I put it in the calendar. I said, yeah, I know that. Can you tell me what the calendar says is going on tonight? So I have a very clear idea of what I'm supposed to do. Maybe I want to know, where am I going to be when this is done with? Or if I'm flying in from a city back home, I'll ask her, hey, what's going on this weekend? So I can get an earlier flight or move things around. I'll make that work as part of that. We have busy lives and busy calendars. We also have clutter in our lives. This is not my house. If it was, my wife would be mad. First of all, I'd bring a picture of our house that looked like that. This is not my house. This is actually organized clutter, though. I look at this, there's a lot of stuff there, but it seems somewhat organized. We have a larger house, and my wife's in charge of everything but my office. My office is my domain, and my office is a domain she hates going into because I'm somebody who's like a pile here, a pile there, a pile here. When she comes in and cleans it up, I can't find anything for months on end. I say, well, I clean it. I'm like, no, that pile was actually like subsection 4 of my brain. I know exactly what I need right there. Where did you put that pile? We live in a world of consumerism. You need more things. So we are fighting against this idea of a simple life and what gives life meaning. So in the back of our minds, we think giving life meaning is a busyness. How many things can you cram into a short schedule to give your life meaning? So I can say, I went to a ball game, and I went to this, and my kids do this, and I do that, and we travel here, and we do this thing, and we do that thing. It's almost as if that's a way for us to check off, yes, our life is meaningful in some way, because look how busy I am. Remember, as a young preacher, I was 22 years old when I moved to Woodson Chapel, and I went to my first preacher's meeting. Phil was not there, so I'm not going to tell on Phil here. He was not there, so it's not him. But at our first meeting there, and the preachers there were talking, and all of them were talking about where they were speaking over the next month. And it was almost as if like a athlete talking about their accomplishments. Well, I'm going to be here, here, and here, and wanted to show off their calendar, their busyness that they had in front of them. Because I felt like, as a 22-year-old, their mindset was, the busier I am, the more important I am. The more things my kids are in, the more things I'm in, the better off I am. Same is true of stuff as well. I'm assuming in Oklahoma, there are people here who buy things just because they want to look like they have some sense of, look what I have, the things that I can accomplish here. I live in suburbia now. I did grow up in West Tennessee, but for a while I had a truck, an F-150 that was lifted with gigantic tires. My old 9-year-old Wesley, sitting in West Tennessee, thought that was the greatest truck in the entire world, lifted one. My suburban dad laughed at myself going, you have a truck that you literally drive your kids to school in, once a day for about a 10-minute drive, and then you go park in the airport. But at least it's lifted and big and loud, so the neighbors know there was a time in your life where this was a cool thing that you had. I eventually sold the truck, but my mindset was, looking at that, I bought that not because of practical reasons, because I felt like it just gave me a sense of, look, I've got this cool truck. I ride around our neighborhood, and there's always things being bought and things being done and families being overburdened because they buy more stuff. And they buy more stuff oftentimes to sort of give them lives a sense of meaning. Simplicity is sort of this fight back of trying to figure out how, in the midst of all the things that we have, the calendars that we have, the things that we want to buy, the stuff that we want to have, the cluttered minds and lives, how do you figure out what's most important? That's the hard thing, I think, about having a busy calendar and a lot of stuff, is having to step back and figure out, how do you squeeze in what's most important if all around you is all the stuff you have to do? If the tyrant of busyness and the tyrant of more things and the tyrant of greater stuff is always there, it makes it harder for us to know exactly what the good life is and fulfilled life should look like. Now, I will say this is going to be more of a Bible class than a sermon. I'm not going to give you 3 points in a poem around how you should be more simplified. Maybe more of an idea. I need you guys to think, because I can't answer for you what a fulfilled life looks like. I can't give you that answer. I can tell you from a biblical standpoint some principles about what God says our life should look like, but that will look different in your context. In fact, it will look different in all of our contexts. I don't expect a dad of 3 kids that's living my life to have the same amount of time and responsibility as somebody who might be retired or somebody in college or someone elsewhere. So I want to get into principles about how exactly can you think about how do you simplify your life. And I hope to take some of these home with me and work on them this weekend maybe to figure out exactly how we simplify things at my house as well. It's about knowledge, about stepping back and knowing some things about yourself. So I want to talk about some keys here. I'll have 4 of these today, and I'm going to talk through these kind of one by one and helping us realize what exactly do we do to figure out how do we get to the point to where your life can be simpler than it was before? How do we get to the point to where we simplify things? Not because we want a simple life. There is a whole almost religion that folks have of sort of an anti-material to an extremist. There's a minimalist movement that kind of takes the idea of simplification beyond just simply let's have less stuff to like now you become your own religion of like you should have less stuff or you're morally wrong in some way. I'm not going to go to that extreme. I want to talk about how do we look at life and look at things of life and figure out how do we create for ourselves maybe a family plan or an individual plan of what's truly important. Because the busyness of the calendar and the busyness of the stuff that we have oftentimes keeps us from what's most important in day-to-day life. And to be real honest, life is sort of geared that way. Advertising and things around us are geared to keep us so moved to have something else or something, not to have a chance to think about deeper things. And some of us, and this is me thinking through even counseling I've had in my past, like to be so busy because we don't want to think about life that deeply. We want to have so many things, we don't have to think about the big things of life. We just go to the next activity, and it can keep us entertained for that next brief moment. So we're going to look at kind of this idea of knowing your priorities. I did use all P's here for you guys who like the alliteration there, so we have those laid out. I will say this, 3 of the 4 were not purposeful. I did 3 of them, and then I realized if you're going to do 3 out of 4, you got to do 4 out of 4. So that's where the 4th one had to come in at that point and make that area. So place is probably a little bit out of place in terms of what we're going to talk about, but it was a P word, and maybe you'll remember it now as you go off and think about simplifying your life in the midst of the busyness that is affirming the faith, which has a calendar that's like, what's the next thing we're going to do here? And so we simplify things as we go along here. What do we do to simplify your life? 1, knowing your priorities. I'm going to go to an Old Testament book, Haggai, and it's one of my favorite books that we have because in the book, you have an Old Testament prophet who is trying to help Israel, who's come back from bondage, to help them think about what's really important in life. They've come back out of their second bondage, the first one being Egyptian, the second one being their 70 years that they're out because of their sin. They've come back to the promised land. It's time for them to think what is going to be the most important aspect of our lives moving forward. So here they are back in the land. They're back where they need to be. The temple lays in ruin. The walls lay in ruin. They have to figure out now what is the highest priority thing that we can do. And Haggai has a phrase he'll use throughout the book. Really the key idea of Haggai is this concept of consider your ways. where Haggai steps back for a moment and says, Israel, I'm looking around and your houses look beautiful. Man, I'm looking at every one of your houses and they're put together and the things look great and they have cedar walls. In fact, the very cedar walls I thought were supposed to be in the temple seem to be right there in your house, and everything's immaculate. It looks like you really have spent a lot of time and priority in making sure what you have looks great. And he steps back and says, now I look down the street at the temple and I'm wondering why exactly it hasn't been touched. And part of the conversation he has with the people of God is, you need to consider your ways and ask yourself, have I misplaced my priorities? We all face a difficulty with what is truly important in life. That's the number one issue of simplicity, is what do you simplify to? Because you can have a simple life in which your entire life is Herb and Johnny. You get up in the morning, you go fishing all day long, you come home at nighttime, you probably inebriate yourself throughout the day, you get the next day and you do it all over again. It looks like a very simple life to an 8-year-old who's drinking his Dr. Pepper out of a glass bottle, because they're so much better than a glass bottle, as a 10-year-old, and watching them go off and thinking, what a dream to go fishing and I have to learn my ABCs or how to count to 20 or math. What a way to do it. If you don't understand your priorities, you can simplify your life and eliminate things that really do matter. So it all starts with, what is most important in your life? What really matters? And for some of us, it's a wake-up call to step back and ask, what does our calendar say is most important? I think in a room that's coming on a Saturday to Affirming the Faith, and is sitting here in a room and is standing up, some of you in the back of the room, you probably, if I ask you a question of, can you tell me what's most important, would probably give me some version of an answer any kid that goes to church would have, and that is Jesus. Always, when I talk to teenagers, I would say, look, if you're ever in a class and someone asks you a question, you probably have a 95% chance the answer is Jesus. So, help out that teacher and just go with something, because there's nothing worse than asking a question and no one responding at all. We'd probably all say priority number one is Jesus. Or we probably as family would say priority number one is getting myself and my family to heaven, or something of that nature. We really emphasize we know what's most important. There was a preacher one time that said, let me figure out what's the most important to you. And they would say, my most important thing is God. He would say, great, can I see your checkbook? Back when we had checkbooks, we wrote ledgers out, and we talk about the way that we spent our money. Maybe it's more of, can I see your calendar? What really do you prioritize in your life to make those things most important? Not just in the sense of, are you stepping back and prioritizing where your time is, but even in the midst of those things, what becomes most important? I don't think we can even start with a series of weighing through what your purpose is and what your fulfilled life is until you step back and ask yourself, what is a priority? Now, this is a class, and so the way I always treat Bible classes is this way. We're going to share stuff, but there's stuff I need you to go home and do something with. So if you come in class and you sit here and you went through and say, well, those are great keys, and you figure out hey, what's the 12 o'clock speaker, which there's no speaker at 12, that's your lunchtime. So you go and eat your lunch, you come back, and you never take any of this with you. There was no keys to this. You just got entertained for a few minutes, or you sat for a few minutes to rest your body before you went on to something else. I need you to go home with this and ask yourself and your family what truly is most important, and ask yourself, if Haggai was looking at our life and saying, consider your ways, what stuff would he be pointing out that says, these things don't seem to match up? That over here you're saying this is most important, but I look at this and it doesn't quite seem to be the case. Now, I can't sit in judgment of you. I don't know most of you, to be quite honest. I know some of you a little bit, and some of you not at all. But the point is, I can't look at your heart and say, what is most important? But do step back and ask yourself, what are the priorities of your life? And then ask yourself, what happens if you keep putting the things that are, in your mind, high priority towards the end of your list? What's the outcome of that? There's a book that talks about 7 habits of highly effective people, and one of the big first ones is begin with the end in mind, to think about things in the future. Now, it's interesting. That book has sold millions of copies. The guy, Covey, has made lots of money doing that book. Covey simply helped us understand what the Hebrew word wisdom means, which wisdom is the idea of living a life that's so skilled that you're able to see not tomorrow, but what the end looks like, and then building your life with principles and habits that build up to that. Part of wisdom is saying, if I stay on the course I am now, what's the most likely outcome of that course? So you consider your ways, ask yourself, where are my priorities? And if I keep the priorities in my life today, what does that look like for me in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? What does it look like for my kids in 5 years, 10 years, and 15 years? And all of a sudden, you might want to think about what you're making most important. Emmett's here in the front row. Some of you know Emmett whenever he was a baby and prayed for him immensely. He has cystic fibrosis. That's something he has. He's not ashamed of it. He'll tell you all about it. You can ask him about it. But that means there are certain things he has to do throughout his day. And so we have to prioritize. The first thing in the morning, he does a breathing treatment, so he is good to go. And the last thing at night's a breathing treatment, so his body can handle things. And if he's going to eat, we prioritize making sure he has his meds at that moment in time where it's going to turn out bad for him. We have a high priority of his treatment in our household. In fact, again, the reason why I worked a second job was initially so that Emmett could be taken care of. That's the priority that we have, because in our mind, what's 10 years, 5 years, 20 years look like for Emmett if we decide we're going to skip treatments and we're going to skip medications? It's not going to be a pretty picture. So we have to have the same priority in our own lives. What does it look like down the road? You know, Emmett here is 8, and yes, he has CF, but Emmett's also a fantastic baseball player who can tell you all about it. But if all I ever do as a dad is help Emmett hit the ball, go inside out the ball and hit that nice swing that takes that ball to left center. If you're a baseball fan, you can see that swing. And all I ever do is have him catch a ball and throw a ball, and I can say, look how great of a dad I am. My son can throw the ball fast and hit the ball hard, but he doesn't know anything about Jesus. I probably misplaced my priorities somewhere along the way. And the point is, you got to ask yourself what it is that you really think's important, and then build your life off of that. Secondly, you got to know your purpose. Now, I will say this. There are a lot of purpose statements in the Bible. There are a lot of ways the Bible tries to describe what is most important. I picked out a few of these, but there are more than this, and I think some of you might even have purpose statements in your family. I have seen families that do this. They step back and they ask themselves, what is the purpose of our family? And they have a statement that they write out that's informed by Scripture. But all of these should feel pretty familiar to you. Jesus asked, kind of sum up the entire Torah, what is all this stuff that we have in the Old Testament, as we call it, all the stuff that we have that teaches us about living and skilled life and about holiness, what is it all summed up as? And the answer is loving God and loving others. That was a key mantra to Jesus. The book of James, James says if you're going to practice the royal law, you have to love your neighbor. And if you don't, you've kind of messed up Christianity altogether. You have to have this at the forefront of things here. Loving God and loving your neighbors. Going back to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and picking up the Leviticus passages and seeing those in the Gospel of Matthew, reminding us that that is an essential part of our Christian purpose. So that has to be something we have to prioritize, right? We got to step back and how in my life am I showing visibly that I love God and love neighbor with the things that I'm doing? Living a life of holiness. You sure to be holy as I am holy. Back in the very beginning covenant that God makes with Israel and continues to make that with us is a covenant where God says, I will be your God and you will be my people and I will dwell amongst you. But part of the commandment of you will be my people and I will dwell amongst you is that we must live holy lives. So you got that in the book of Leviticus. You get it in 1 Peter as well, and other spots reminding us that we're supposed to live a life of holiness, of being set apart for God's purposes and privileges, and living a life that way, of understanding our place in God's kingdom. So there's that part of your purpose in life, stepping back and asking yourself, how am I being used by God and living a life where I'm trying to glorify Him? There's the Romans chapter 8 passage I actually love. In Romans 8 where it talks about, we sometimes get bogged down because the word predestined is there. And we miss the idea that he's not saying you're predestined to automatically have salvation, but he's saying God has predestined. This has been God's purpose, that those who follow Jesus would become like his son. The purpose of following Jesus is to become like him. If you have salvation, your number one goal in life is to become more and more like Jesus. That should be a priority and a purpose. So ask yourself in your life and the time, the things you do and what you emphasize and what your family emphasizes, are you becoming more or less like Jesus? That's sometimes hard for us to do because the self-deception becomes strong amongst most people, right? Well, yes, we're becoming more like Jesus because we're doing this, or we twist things. But I need to have honest conversations. Preachers can do all that we can to say, here's the Word of God, here's the application of the Word of God, but I can't go into your heart and say, change. I have to have you do that, and you have to step back and ask yourself, how do I take this message and live it out? So part of this is asking the questions of, how do I become more like Jesus? How do I become to where I am concerned about fighting against sin? And I'm concerned about people. I'm concerned about the will of God. To me, those are things that are important for us to step back and ask ourselves. Well, the old one from one of my favorite books on the idea of living a life, a fulfilled life, when the writer of Ecclesiastes goes through his experiments talking about the various ways to find meaning. And if you read Ecclesiastes, the very things that we attempt to find meaning in our lives today, he already tried that. Solomon thought about riches, and there it was, and he had them all, and he said, look, at the end of the day, we all die, and someone else gets all of those riches that you had. All the toil you put up, and someone else grabs it. Or all the stuff that you have goes off to someone who doesn't care anything at all about it. My father-in-law is a car guy. And what I mean by that is he knows how to fix cars, and he cares about cars. Right now, he doesn't have a cool car he's working on, but I think one of his fears is one day he'll have a super cool car, and it'll get passed down to me, and I'll be like, what is this thing? Because I am a functional guy. Does it get me to point A to point B in driving? I am not hugely mechanical. In fact, I'm surprised my wife married me, because I am not like what was it? Was it red, green? Hey, if you're not handsome, you must be handy. Well, I'm not handy, so that leaves one category for me, I guess, in being able to convince my wife to marry me, because fixing things is not a strong point. In fact, every now and then I get like hey, you got to put the towel rack back up. I'm thinking, sure will. Is that like, has to be done this decade, next? How soon do we need this taken care of here? So I always wonder, somebody like who's a big-time car guy who passes off, and he gives that car to somebody who's 3 generations down the road, and that kid sees the car and is like, I want to sell this and get one of those cars that, goes beep, beep, and has loud things in the back, and he sells a classic out because he doesn't care about it. That's me in Ecclesiastes, where Solomon says you can have all this stuff and someone else gets it and doesn't care even 1 minute about it. I've got a lot of University of Tennessee stuff, and luckily Emmett's a University of Tennessee fan, but I can imagine if somebody came to our house and saw that and said, well, let's go to the junk option, we'll see if we can get $1 a piece for those things that are cherished memories of mine. Sometimes in life it's about what you can acquire. It's about the pleasure you can have. We do live in a world that thinks pleasure is the number one thing. If you're on social media, the very idea of pleasure is just personified, whether it's, again, the sexualizing of everything in our culture today, or it's the push to this idea of life is all about these moments in time that are just unmistakable when you have a picture there. In fact, I was reading a tourist, a guy who does local tours in some of the Grecian islands. And he's like, these major tourist spots aren't worth going to because it takes so long to see something, because you've got a line of hundreds of folks trying to snap the perfect selfie back and forth to get the shot behind it. And that's the idea of this adrenaline rush of look at me. Solomon says, ultimately, if you want to get down what life's for, it's fearing God and keeping his commandments. Well, the idea of Jesus, the greatest among you will be a servant to all. My point in all this is not to say there's just one purpose statement. There are multiple in the Bible. Ultimately, it comes down to our life is to honor God and glorify him in what we do. But we have to think about, what is our purpose? Why are we existing here? Because if you think your purpose is simply to fill up a calendar, or make yourself feel important, or do the next thing, or have one more thing the next guy does, or have one more dollar, or a bigger house, or a nicer car, then you're always going to be pushing things and working at things that just aren't going to matter in the grand scheme of things. You're always going to be moving away from simplicity. I was in Arizona last week doing a Sherman Share Preachers Workshop and preaching for a church out there, and one of the gentlemen who was leading it alongside me was a former preacher and elder in Michigan. And he talked about how there was a guy who wanted a house. And the guy had a very nice house, but the house that he always wanted went for sale. And he was worked on a car line and realized, I can afford that house if I pick up overtime. That's what the guy did. He said, we never saw the guy at church again, but maybe once every quarter. And he would say, well, this church is not a family like it used to be anymore. And you always go back and think, well, maybe it's because all of a sudden you prioritized having that bigger house, so now you're at work 7 days a week, and you're not a part of the family. Now, look, I grew up in households where sometimes you had to work on Sundays. That's the shift you had to pay your bills. That's one thing. Another thing is the folks who do it because they're trying to get that next level, that next thing. It's hard to simplify your life if you're chasing wrong priorities and wrong purposes there. So you got to ask yourself again, what is my purpose in life? Why do I exist? Because there's always going to be a need for purpose. This is the nature of how we are as humans. Like, we need some reason to live. Otherwise, we just live a life of complete just sort of chaos. We've got to have some reason to exist. So we choose a reason to exist that best fits the moment. So for some people, it might be my reason to exist is I need to be busy, or my kids need to be busy, or whatever it might be. And we start prioritizing that. And we give ourselves false purposes. And the result is that becomes what's most important. Knowing what your purpose is matters. Jesus gives life's purpose. God gives life true purpose. Those are actually there in the Bible for us to consider. But absent of that, you think your purpose in life is to, have the most stuff when it's all said and done. One writer one time compared life to a game. At the end of Monopoly, you put all the stuff back on the board and you close the box up, and no one cares how many mansions you had or how many hotels you had on Boardwalk, because it's over with. But yeah, sometimes we think that's how life works its way through it. Now, as a Monopoly player, who I have never lost at Monopoly, except for the time my wife and my mom cheated purposely to beat me in Monopoly, I understand the importance of board games. But the point is, that's how life we should understand that the things that we value are all going to be gone one day. So understanding our true purpose is extremely important for us, because you're always going to have a different one. Somebody will give you a purpose. The boss will give you a purpose and say, look, your number one goal in life is to make the company the most possible money you can. So go out there and sacrifice your family and your time. Yeah. Look, I lead a healthcare sales team. We are extremely sort of high standards. I know that. There's a temptation for me as a boss at times to tell somebody, why are you going to your kid's game at 7 o'clock? Shouldn't you be on an air? Like, no, I step back. Like, that's not the most important thing in life. There's that pressure. Somebody will give you a purpose if you don't have one. Yeah. Someone will use them for their own purpose if you don't have one there. So know your priorities, know your purpose, know your place. We have to step back and ask ourselves kind of two questions. One, the most important is, you're a child of God. That's important to let that center everything in your life. No matter how insignificant or significant you feel, you should be getting your value from who you are in Jesus. It should be from the 1 Peter 2, reminding us that you're a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a people after God's own heart, His own special people. That should be what centers us in life. Otherwise, again, we try to get our meaning in life based off everything else. So kind of know your place. Know who you are. And that should change your priorities compared to other folks who don't know who they are. But also kind of know your place. And what I mean by that is, we all have different seasons in life. Some of you have gone through the raising of kids, and you're now in the grandparent phase, which, having both seen my parents, and then my parents become grandparents, and my wife's experience of her parents, and then her parents becoming grandparents, when you have grandkids, y'all just change, right? It's like all of a sudden, all the stuff that matters don't matter anymore. Like, growing up, we had a room in the house that kids couldn't go into. It was a special, room to just look at as a kid's museum. That's the fancy spot that adults can go into, and that's where you walked in. You weren't allowed in there. My grandkids could go in that room with red Kool-Aid and just it's all good to go. Big deal there. Know your place in life. What I want to say by that is, you sometimes have to ask yourself right now what's most important. So as a dad, my kids take a high priority over all other stuff. When they're out of the house, they have their own families. It very well might be I have more time to do other things that I want to do. I don't have a ton of hobbies. People ask me, hey, both those I work with in the healthcare tech company and those at church, what do you do for fun? And my answer, honestly, is typically the fun I have in my life is going to watch my kids play sports or doing something with them. Yeah. Or showing up to an event that they have. That's what I do. That's my place in life. And at first, people are taken aback. I don't know. Don't feel bad for me. I love it. That's what I love doing, because that's the spot I have right now in life. I think about 15 years from now, when they're out of the house, there'll probably be something else to have more time with. One of my closest friends and mentors, an elder, he's now also an empty nester. His time is spent differently than mine. He can do a lot more stuff at nighttime than I can, going and visiting and being with the various people at Woodson Chapel, than he could even 4 or 5 years ago when his son was in high school, because all of a sudden that season in life changes. So I don't want you to think for a moment that simplicity looks the same for every single person. I think some folks have the old monastic idea that simple life is to go off into some desert cave, eat beans, and sit there and just kind of live. I have in my mind Nacho Libre. You have this beans and chips, and you're sitting there, and your life is just ruined that way, and that's what everything's about, and that gives you the simplicity that God's looking for. I don't know, you have stages in life, so there's going to be times where, we've got to schedule in what kids have and what we have and what we're doing, but just understanding that based on your season, things can change, but your priorities and your purpose shouldn't. What you might do in that moment might change, but the ultimate priorities of your life of serving God and those purposes don't change in that time. So some of you who don't have kids at home, I expect there's probably more free time you have to do things that are more on your own schedule than your kids. And those of you who have kids at home, I don't want you to feel guilty about the fact that, look, I can't do everything I want to do, or maybe some things I'd like to do because I've got kids' things as well. That's the season you have in life, and so live that out. But do so intentionally, thinking about what's of the highest purpose and priority here. I do think at times we can use busyness, whether it's a job that we have in that moment in time there, or whether it's the kids that we have, or whether it's the spouse that we have, and we can use that as an excuse to sort of throw away our priorities. Well, it's busy right now, so we're not going to do this anymore. Now you have to step back and think, we don't use it as an excuse. We understand reality, but it's not an excuse for us not to put God first. Again, I don't know your season in life. I think we have some single folks, some newly married folks, some people who look like they, just judging by the gray hair, that maybe you've already moved past kids in your life and those things. You got people like me who every chance I get want to take my son or my daughter's just with me. So I'm with them on those times that I'm traveling and get that time together. But you got to understand where your place in life is. Some practical things we do in our family, and one of those is this right here. If I can travel somewhere for either job, my kids can come with me, they're going to go with me. So Emmett's here with me now. My daughter will go to New York with me in a few weeks. I got to go up there and meet with the healthcare system. I'll meet with them at the hotel lobby, and her and I will then spend some time in New York City so we can have that one-on-one time so I can be a dad as much as I can be in those moments in time there. When we travel, we try to find churches. That's important for us to realize, hey, we're traveling, we're going spots. There's God's people anywhere you go. That's an important thing I want my kids to know about. Those are things that we have in our season of life. We play travel sports, which means we have Saturday games, in which we have to make tough decisions on Sunday of, hey guys, we're going to end up going to church and then going to the game. We're going to end up going to church there first. Those are all sort of decisions you have to make in the moment in your season of life to balance those things out. If you don't have priorities and purpose, you're going to let life's calendar and busyness take over. Next up is know your pitfalls. A Hebrew writer talks about sin and stuff that entangles us. Obviously, sin is something we want to avoid, but there's also the things that just entangle us, that keep us. What are your pitfalls? Most of us should be able to step back and say, what are the things that I think can overload my schedule? In the position at the company I'm at, one of the things I had to do in January was step back and say, what will I no longer do? And that's an interesting thing to think about, because I'm always the person that says yes, but what will I no longer do so the company can succeed with everybody else kind of doing stuff that they're supposed to do? I have things that are more important. You have to step back and say, I'm going to say no to this. But you have to know the things you want to do, or the things that you used to that might be pitfalls for you to fall back into some of these habits. Know your life. I will say this, sports is a big deal to me. My mom was a huge sports fan. My dad was kind of a tolerant, watch it just to make us mad and make comments about how bad Tennessee was that year. But my mom was a sports fan that taught me things like if you yell loud enough, maybe, just maybe, that player can hear you across the TV and not miss the tackle next time they have a chance to do so. I grew up in that kind of a household. I know that sports can be a thing that keeps me in misplaced priorities. Whether it's the overly caring about a game on television or it's my kids' achievement in sports, I know those are pitfalls. So I have to step back and ask myself what's that makes most sense. Second, I know I am competitive, which means in the workplace that I'm in, I want to keep climbing a ladder. I want to be the guy who's the guy, right? That's kind of the competitive nature. That's a pitfall because the cost sometimes of climbing that ladder is what are you giving up on the back end? How do you balance those things out? What are you losing at that moment in time? You got to know yourself and know your pitfalls. Otherwise, you'll just keep making the same mistake over and over again. I've got 4 minutes left, so I'm going to go through these next two somewhat quickly. But the slide deck, I can send it to you. But the homework is actually yours after this. I want you, and I wish I would have known that your theme this year at North College was the good life, and I would have used good instead of fulfilled here to kind of go along with the theme. But I need to understand, you need to ask yourself, what is my good life? What does my fulfilled life look like? Paint yourself a picture. One of the ways you can simplify your life is to step back and say, ideally, what would my life look like? And then write that out. Paint a picture of that. Hopefully, as a Christian, the fulfilled life is not the worldly fulfillment of like, I have everything that I want and need, but it's more of what's a God-honoring life look like, and what's that vision? Sometimes we have to be able to see what exactly something looks like so we can work towards that. That's why Jesus becoming flesh and dwelling amongst us, giving us that example is so powerful. It gives us an example of what we can work towards. But we have to come back and just draw the picture of what exactly do I want my life to look like? And if I can make my life look like that, what do I have to do? What do I have to add and subtract to get there? I can't answer what a fulfilled life looks for you other than broad things. Hopefully it's honoring Jesus and living a life that glorifies Him. But you've got individual circumstances. You have to check yourself in my context. What does it look like? Does it look like making sure 2 days a week we're sitting around a table at a meal instead of chasing somewhere and we're eating and we're talking about our days? Does it look like at a ball field on Saturday we're making sure at least during that time that our kids are good examples? Does it look like making sure on a Sunday we're at, whatever? What does that look like in your context? Does it look like if Dad travels for 3 days that week, he makes sure when he gets home he's taking a red eye so he can make sure he's with the kids as long as he possibly can? That's what his good life looks like. You got to look at that. And if you look at that, you then ask yourself, what am I choosing to buy or do that's going to lead to that fulfillment? You got your rubric. What's my priorities? What's my purpose? What's my place? Then you step back and think, let's paint the picture of what life should look like if I were doing these things in order here. Then ask yourself, okay, to get from here to here, what my life is now to this, what choices do I have to make? I can't simplify your life in a moment. I think, didn't Netflix have a show like some lady would go up and say, does this give you joy? It's almost like some Jedi mind trick, like yes or no. No, you just throw it away. I always joke, like, imagine the neighbor kid you don't like. Don't like this kid. They're going to throw it out the door. You're like, does this give you joy? Get rid of it. We all want some kind of a quick hammer that can do it. You're finished with it, kind of a thing just to give us simple answers. It's not going to be a quick go into a room and say, does this give me joy? It's going to be more of a life learning of how do we develop this. There's a biblical word for that called sanctification. And what that word has to do is the fact that there's this constant looking at your life and saying, I'm here. Jesus is there. How do I get from here to there? And there's repentance, and there's changes, and there's prayers, and there's help along the way to get me from here to there. But until I can step back and say, what does my fulfilled, what does my good life look like? I don't have a target to get to. And until I know things like, back to our very first slide here, my priorities, purpose, and place in those pitfalls, I can't paint that picture. So I'm hoping I give you some tools that you can paint a picture of what a fulfilled life looks like for you and your family. Then I hope I give you the encouragement to put in the work to get from point A to point B. And speaking of point A to point A is right here. I'm finished. And point B, I think, is lunch. So you guys can head that way and finish up. But thank you for your attentive this morning.
Thank you.